For centuries, the story of Edward II of England has been told as a medieval tragedy, but few dare to mention the real horror that hid behind the closed doors of Berkeley Castle. The castration and death of the King's favourite were not merely acts of vengeance. They were a spectacle of cruelty, humiliation and power, designed to erase from English memory the most scandalous love of the Middle Ages. Edward II, a passionate king, dared to defy the rules of court and church by becoming involved with Piers Gaveston, a young man of striking beauty and boundless ambition. Gaveston was not only the king's advisor, he was the man who made the king forget his crown. The hatred of the English nobility grew as the favoritism and intimacy between the two became public. Gaveston was arrogant, provocative, and boasted of his power over the king, calling the lords fools and mocking even the queen. The result was inevitable: betrayal, capture, torture. But what happened next surpassed all limits of human brutality. It is said he was castrated and executed in such a barbaric way that even the executioners hesitated to describe the details. Edward, devastated, swore revenge. But fate had prepared for him an equally cruel end, imprisoned, humiliated and killed in a manner that remains debated by historians and conspiracists to this day. Some say he was murdered with a red-hot poker inserted mercilessly. Others claim he escaped and lived in secret. What is certain is that the forbidden love of a king became one of the darkest and most sensual stories in English monarchy. So before we uncover the secrets behind this passion and death, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. It helps YouTube understand that you want more real and haunting stories like this one. And watch until the end, because the final revelation will completely change what you think about the true fate of Edward II. Imagine being born the heir to an empire, yet seen as a disappointment from your very first cry. Such was the beginning of the life of Edward of Caernarfon, the future King Edward II of England. Born in 1284, the son of the fearsome Edward III, the Hammer of the Scots, the young prince grew up in a world where weakness was not merely despised, but punished. His father was a man of war, known for his ruthless discipline and boundless ambition, but young Edward seemed to belong to another world, curious, artistic, and guided more by emotion than by conquest. While the king demanded blood, loyalty, and iron, his son preferred poetry, music, and the company of those who made him feel alive, especially other young courtiers who shared his love for beauty and affection. From an early age, the prince's tutors noticed something different about him. Edward had little interest in commanding armies. He wanted to play instruments, draw, and organize performances. He loved feasts, laughter, and long conversations by candlelight. He was not made for the battlefield, but for human connection, for the seduction of words and presence. And in a court dominated by men who measured worth by the number of enemies slain, that was seen as dangerous. Many called the prince weak, soft, unfit for the throne. Others described him as charming, charismatic, with an almost androgynous beauty and eyes too gentle for the cruelty of medieval politics. But behind his sensitivity lay deep loneliness, the weight of being a prince who fit neither his father's expectations nor his kingdom's ideals. Edward I, his father, was not merely stern, he was merciless. Their relationship was marked by constant tension. The king despised his son's artistic and emotional nature, viewing it as a threat to the legacy he was building. Historical accounts suggest that Edward I publicly punished the prince for his shameful inclinations and for surrounding himself with companions deemed unworthy of royalty. It was as if every smile from the young prince reminded the father of what he most loathed, humanity itself. That rejection carved within Edward II a desperate need to be loved, understood, and accepted, a void that would later explain his intense and controversial relationships with the men who would shape his fate. As he grew, the prince learned to hide his emotions behind a mask of charm. He became the center of attention at feasts and tournaments, not for his sword but for his wit. He was elegant, playful, spontaneous, everything a medieval king was not supposed to be. Yet the people adored him. Many saw in the young prince a soul closer to their own, someone who preferred speaking with craftsmen and musicians over bargaining with lords and warriors. This genuine bond with the common people clashed with the contempt of the nobility, who saw in him a prince ruled by the heart instead of reason. It was within this atmosphere of expectation, fear, and quiet rebellion that Edward began to develop a dual nature. The gentle, charming prince who captivated those around him, and the wounded man within, determined to find a place where he could simply be himself. To history he may appear naive, even innocent, but there was something profoundly human in his fragility, and it was precisely that humanity that would make him a different kind of king. Hated by many, loved by few, and remembered for centuries as the monarch who dared to love in a world built to hate. While the throne awaited him and the shadows of fate crept closer, Edward had yet to realize that the true battlefield of his life would not be against foreign enemies, but against his own heart, and the fury of those who would never accept him. They say some people enter our lives like a breath of fresh air, and others like a storm that changes everything forever. For Edward, the young prince, suffocated by the rules and coldness of the English court, Piers Gaveston was both at once. He appeared in Edward's adolescence like a bolt of lightning, handsome, intelligent, with a magnetic charisma and an audacity that defied every boundary of royal etiquette. Gaveston was a Gascon nobleman of modest origins, but he possessed something that set him apart from everyone else. He made Edward laugh. In a palace full of schemers, flatterers, and men who feared the king, Piers spoke to him as an equal, without fear, without excessive reverence. And that was precisely what captured the prince's heart. Their friendship grew rapidly, fueled by complicity, secrets, and an attraction that everyone at court noticed, but no one dared to name. Edward saw in Piers something he had never found in his father or his advisors, someone who saw him as a man, not just as heir to the throne. They spent hours together hunting, riding, or simply talking by the lakeside. Edward began showering him with gifts, jewels, horses, lands, affectionately calling him "my brother of the heart." But to the watchful eyes of the court, there was nothing brotherly about their bond. The light in the prince's eyes, the way he smiled when Gaveston approached, the impulsive and protective gestures, everything revealed something deeper. As the years passed, their bond became unbreakable. When Edward ascended to the throne in 1307, one of his first acts as king was to bring Gaveston back to England. He had been exiled by Edward's father for his improper influence. Now, with power in his own hands, Edward rewarded him with titles, wealth, and authority. Piers Gaveston became the Earl of Cornwall, one of the most prestigious titles in England, and that was when friendship turned into scandal. The lords and nobles of the realm were furious. How could a foreigner of modest birth hold such a position, receiving privileges that even the greatest dukes could not dream of? Piers, far from acting humbly, seemed to delight in the hatred he provoked. Arrogant, sarcastic, and provocative, he openly mocked powerful lords, calling them ignorant and cowardly. He even gave offensive nicknames to members of the royal family, comparing them to ridiculous characters from contemporary plays. At feasts and banquets, he flaunted extravagant clothes and paraded the gifts from the king, a direct insult to the English nobility. Meanwhile, Edward seemed blind to the chaos forming around him. The king defended Gaveston fiercely, defying Parliament and the Church, insisting that he was the most loyal and worthy man he had ever known. The truth was that Edward loved him, and that unshakable devotion turned the kingdom into a powder keg. With every new favor or title granted, resentment among the nobles grew stronger. They saw the king's favoritism not just as political folly, but as moral disgrace. To them, Gaveston symbolized the decay of Edward II, a ruler guided by passion rather than reason. And yet, there is something almost poetic in that forbidden love. In a world where alliances were bought and marriages sealed treaties, Edward and Piers built something purely human, dangerous but real. It wasn't just desire, it was an escape from emptiness, a desperate search for affection in a world ruled by fear. Gaveston knew the power he held and often used it to manipulate the king, securing privileges and influence. Still, some say that deep down, he truly loved Edward, in his own selfish, impulsive yet sincere way. What began as friendship became the greatest scandal of medieval England. The people whispered, the lords conspired, and the clergy condemned their bond as a sin against God. Even so, Edward refused to let him go. It was as if he preferred to lose his crown rather than the man who made him feel alive. And perhaps, without realizing it, that was his sentence. Soon, the love that defied kings and traditions would turn into tragedy. England was about to witness the brutal downfall of the man who dared to be loved by a king, and of the king who dared to love him. In the history of England's monarchs, few marriages were as politically perfect and emotionally disastrous as that of Edward II and Isabella of France. She was beautiful, educated, the daughter of Europe's most powerful king, Philip IV the Fair. He was a newly crowned monarch, hopelessly in love with a man the entire kingdom despised. Their marriage was sealed in 1308, in a lavish ceremony that promised a new era of peace between England and France. But the honeymoon had barely ended when the fairy tale turned into a game of betrayal, jealousy, and hatred disguised as diplomacy. From the very first day, Isabella realized there was no room for her in her husband's heart. That space already belonged to Piers Gaveston. During the coronation, the most symbolic moment of the reign, Edward made a mistake that would echo across Europe. Instead of placing his wife by his side on the throne, he kept Gaveston close, showering him with titles and gazes that spoke louder than words. The Queen was humiliated before the entire court. The king's favorite paraded around in luxurious garments, many of them made from jewels and fabrics originally meant for Isabella. French ambassadors returned to Paris in outrage, reporting that the English king treated his companion as a queen and his queen as nothing. That humiliation Isabella would never forgive. As the years passed, their relationship became a cold performance. Edward tried to maintain appearances, but Isabella could see the contempt hidden in his gestures. The young queen, who had grown up surrounded by power and intrigue in the French court, quickly learned to play the same game. She waited, watched, and planned. When Gaveston was captured and executed by enraged nobles, many believed the nightmare had ended. But for Isabella, it was only the beginning. The grieving king soon found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser, a man even more ambitious, manipulative, and cruel. Despenser lacked Gaveston's charm, but made up for it with cunning and ruthlessness. He saw that the king was emotionally dependent and completely took control. He began to dictate who could approach Edward, interfere in state affairs, and eliminate anyone who dared oppose him. Under his influence, the kingdom descended into corruption and fear. The queen, now a mother of four, found herself increasingly isolated. The king no longer listened to her or respected her, and Despenser treated her with open disdain, seizing her lands and keeping her under surveillance. The she-wolf of France began to awaken. When Despenser's tyranny became unbearable even to the most loyal, Isabella realized the fate of the realm depended on her. While Edward sank deeper into paranoia and submission, she quietly drew close to her husband's enemies, nobles, clergymen, and political exiles. In public, she still smiled, but in secret, she wove a web that would unite England England's greatest traitors under one purpose: to destroy the king and the man who ruled him. The breaking point came when Edward, under Despenser's influence, confiscated the Queen's property and separated her from her children. Humiliated, Isabella fled to France, officially on a diplomatic mission, but in truth, into voluntary exile. There, under the protection of her brother, the new French king, she met Roger Mortimer, an exiled English nobleman, intelligent, daring, and magnetic. And that meeting changed everything. What began as a political alliance turned into a passionate affair and an epic conspiracy. Isabella and Mortimer became lovers and partners in rebellion. Together, they planned the unthinkable: to invade England, overthrow the king, and avenge every humiliation. While Edward clung blindly to Despenser's power, the winds of vengeance began to blow from France. In 1326, Isabella returned, no longer as a submissive wife, but as a conqueror. With an army and the support of the discontented nobility, she captured her husband and ordered the brutal execution of Despenser, a public spectacle of torture that marked the end of one era and the dawn of her rule. Edward II was deposed, humiliated, and imprisoned in a cold, damp cell, while Isabella ruled in the name of their son, Edward III. The love that once defied kings and kingdoms was now nothing more than an echo, and the king who loved too deeply was about to pay the highest price for it. The woman who had once been ignored beside the throne was now called the she-wolf of France, and all of England trembled at her roar. What began as a defiant and forbidden love turned into a bloody spectacle of betrayal, vengeance, and despair. Edward II, the king who dared to love in a time when love was considered a sin, watched everything he had, power, friends, crown, and heart, crumble before his eyes. And it all began with the capture of Piers Gaveston, the man who had won the prince's heart and scandalized England. In 1312, after years of exiles, returns, and broken promises, Gaveston's luck ran out. The nobles, tired of the king's favoritism and arrogance, decided that death was the only way to restore order. They captured him in an ambush, took him into custody, and without mercy, executed him brutally. It is said he was beheaded on a lonely hill, while the wind carried the echo of his screams to the castle, where the powerless king awaited news. When Edward learned of his death, he lost his mind. He wept publicly, refused to eat, and swore vengeance on the killers of the man he called my brother of the heart. But by then, the throne he sat on was already beginning to collapse. England was torn apart by internal divisions. The nobility despised him, and the people saw him as a weak king, ruled by emotion rather than wisdom. Time passed, but the wound never healed. In the emptiness left by Gaveston, a new companion appeared, Hugh Despenser, an ambitious and dangerous man who knew how to fill the king's heart while also controlling his power. Despenser was not the lover who brought joy, but the advisor who brought domination. He manipulated the king, eliminated enemies, and turned the palace into a place of fear. Under his influence, Edward confiscated properties, exiled nobles, and even ordered opponents killed. The kingdom became a field of intrigue and terror, and Despenser's name became synonymous with hatred. But the king, blinded by devotion, saw none of it. To him, Hugh was the last refuge, the only man left amidst the chaos. Yet love, when mixed with power and obsession, turns into a curse. In 1326, vengeance finally came. Isabella of France, now known as the she-wolf of France, returned from exile with an army and the support of rebellious nobles. She did not come merely to take the throne. She came to destroy the man who had taken everything from her. The campaign was swift and devastating. Edward fled in desperation with Despenser but was captured within weeks. The king was deposed and imprisoned. His lover was handed over to his enemies. And that was when the horror began. The execution of Hugh Despenser went down in history as one of the cruelest ever recorded. Before a crowd and under Isabella's cold gaze, he was dragged through the streets, insulted and stripped naked. First, he was publicly castrated, a symbolic punishment for the man accused of crimes against nature with the king. Then he was hanged, but cut down before death to prolong his agony. His body was opened, his entrails burned before his eyes while he was still alive, until he was finally beheaded and quartered. His remains were sent to different cities across the kingdom as a warning to all who might dare repeat the same offense. Edward, locked in his cell, received the news and broke down. It was not only the end of his lover, but the reflection of his own fate. He had seen his loves massacred before the nation and realized, too late, that the power of the heart was the most dangerous of all. The man who loved too deeply, who believed he could rule with emotion instead of iron, was now nothing more than a prisoner, crownless, friendless, and without comfort. The throne was lost, and with it the soul of a king who had traded fear for affection and paid the price in blood. But the story does not end there. Edward's suffering was far from over. The Queen, intoxicated by power and vengeance, had even darker plans for her defeated husband. And what happened within the cold walls of Berkeley Castle remains to this day shrouded in mystery, pain, and rumors that chill even the most skeptical hearts. The fall of a king is rarely silent, and that of Edward II was a scream muffled by stone, fear, and betrayal. The man who had once ruled England with love, weakness, and stubbornness was now alone, locked within the damp walls of Berkeley Castle, without a crown, without allies, and without hope. Isabella, the woman who had sworn before God to love him, had become his jailer, and the new master of England was her lover, Roger Mortimer, the same man who had once pretended to be the king's friend. The irony was that Edward, who had always feared losing power, ended up losing everything human about himself long before death arrived. Taken under heavy guard, he was treated not as a former monarch, but as an ordinary prisoner. The castle cells were cold, damp, and infested with rats. Some accounts claim that his jailers received direct orders to make him suffer slowly, without leaving visible marks. A silent, cruel, and calculated revenge. For months, he was allegedly kept in near total isolation, deprived of light and warmth. The once elegant king, who had paraded in silks and jewels, now wore rags and shivered in the dark. His hair grew wild, his skin turned pale, and his eyes, once alive and bright, became hollow. Even in captivity, Edward still believed he might return. He wrote desperate letters, begging for mercy, pleaded to see his children, but his words never reached their destination. Isabella and Mortimer feared that his continued existence would threaten the throne of young Edward III, who was little more than a puppet under their control. And so began one of the darkest plots in English history, the disappearance of Edward II. In September 1327, rumors spread that something terrible had happened at Berkeley Castle. The king, they said, was dead. But how did he die? The answer was never clear, and perhaps that is why his story continues to echo like a ghost through the corridors of time. One of the most infamous and horrifying of versions describes an execution born of nightmare. According to chronicles of the time, Mortimer and Isabella ordered the king to be killed without shedding blood, to avoid visible evidence of murder. The solution, they say, was diabolical. A red-hot iron rod was inserted through Edward's rectum, burning him from within up to his heart, a symbolic punishment for his carnal sins and forbidden loves. His death was said to be slow and silent, muffled by screams no one dared to answer. But others claim it was all a fabrication. Later accounts, discovered years after, suggest that Edward did not die that night. Some believe that loyal guards, moved by pity, helped him escape, leaving an unrecognizable body in his place. According to this version, he fled to the continent and lived out his days as a hermit under another name, hidden in monasteries and distant villages. There is even a mysterious letter found decades later, written by a man calling himself William, former King of England, describing his escape and repentance. Many historians dismiss the document as legend, but others swear the handwriting matches that of the former monarch. The truth is that no one ever truly knew what happened. Edward's body was never shown publicly. Only a sealed coffin was taken to Gloucester Abbey, and to this day doubts remain about whether the man buried there was really the king. The Queen's silence on the matter was equally suspicious. After his supposed death, Isabella never again spoke publicly of her husband. She lived her final years in isolation, fallen from grace, while Mortimer was hanged for treason. It seemed that divine justice had finally caught up with all who conspired against the king. Edward II, meanwhile, became an enigma. Some see him as a martyr of love, a man punished for defying convention and loving beyond what his time allowed. Others view him as a weak ruler, consumed by passion and folly. But regardless of the version, one thing is certain: his story endured. And the echo of his cries, or perhaps his escape, still resounds within the ruins of Berkeley Castle, where many visitors claim to hear moans at nightfall. Perhaps it is nothing but the ancient wind, or the final breath of a king who never accepted death. For centuries, the name of Edward II was synonymous with weakness, scandal, and shame. Medieval chroniclers painted him as the king who traded his throne for passion and ruined an empire for impure desires. But time, the great judge of history, has rewritten his fate. What was once seen as sin is now understood as courage. Edward II was not just a defeated king. He was a man who dared to live according to his heart in an age when love itself could mean death. Humanity has rediscovered in him something his enemies never could see: sensitivity, loyalty, and the strength to defy the impossible. In the centuries that followed, his image was reclaimed by writers, historians, and artists. In the 16th century, the playwright Christopher Marlowe turned his life into poetic tragedy in the play Edward II, portraying the king not as weak, but as a man condemned for loving whom he should not. In cinema, his story has continued to move audiences through films and series that explore the human side of the monarch, a man torn between duty and desire, between crown and heart. In modern times, scholars have revisited his letters and records, finding in them a rare tenderness and vulnerability. Edward wrote like someone who felt too deeply. In one of his most quoted letters, he refers to Gaveston with a tenderness that transcends centuries. "Without you, the world has neither light nor warmth." It's impossible not to feel the weight of that phrase. A silent cry of love from a king chained by the expectations of his time. Today, Edward II is remembered not as a failed monarch, but as a symbol of resistance. He became, perhaps unintentionally, an icon of the fight for the freedom to love, for the courage to be authentic even when the world demands masks. His story echoes in modern movements that defend human rights, diversity, and love in all its forms. Many see in Edward a forerunner, someone who, even within a system that suffocated him, refused to deny who he was. His fall was not merely the end of a reign. It was the beginning of a shift in consciousness that continues to inspire centuries later. And there is something profoundly moving in that. The man who died isolated, hated, and forgotten by all is now celebrated as a symbol of empathy and genuine love. Within the cold walls of Berkeley Castle, where his voice was silenced, tributes are now made. Visitors leave flowers, candles, and notes of gratitude, as if the world were finally apologizing for having judged him so harshly. Edward II did not achieve military glory, but he conquered something far more enduring, the heart of history. He was the king who dared to love, and that same love the one that destroyed him, ultimately granted him eternity. And that is how the story of Edward II ends. The king the world tried to erase, but time turned into legend. A man who loved beyond the rules, who fell, suffered, and was betrayed, but who left behind a legacy impossible to ignore. With each new generation, his name resurfaces as a powerful reminder. Love can lead to ruin, but it is also what makes us immortal. Perhaps his crown was torn away, perhaps his body was destroyed, but what no one could burn was his heart. The same heart that still beats in the pages of history, on the stage, on the screen, and in the memories of those who believe love should never be a crime. And if you've made it this far, it means you've been touched by this story as deeply as I have. So before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps YouTube understand that you value stories that reveal the human side behind great tragedies. Every subscription and every like ensures that the algorithm brings stories like this to more people, and that how forgotten histories find new life. But now I want to hear from you. What did you think of Edward II US story? Do you believe he was really murdered, or that he survived and lived in hiding? Leave your comment below. I read them all, and your thoughts inspire me for the next episodes. And before you go, don't miss the video appearing on the screen now. It's even more intense, more mysterious, and without a doubt, more captivating than this one. Click and discover another true story that will leave you breathless. Because in the end, history is only forgotten when we stop telling it, and here, it lives on.